Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building Strong Labor Management Relations, Best Practices, Common Goals, Lessons Learned, Invest in the Relationships, Learn from the Journey. I'm LaShonda Dawkins. I serve as the chair of the APTA Labor and Employee Relations Subcommittee. In my day job, I am the Assistant General Manager of Human Resources at Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority in Atlanta, Georgia. I, along with the Labor Subcommittee Vice Chair, Patrice McElroy, who serves as the Executive Officer, Talent Management, Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, Los Angeles, California, will co-moderate today's webinar.
LaShonda, it looks like Patrice's phone may have gone offline, so if you would continue, please.
We are so pleased to welcome our co-hosts and partners, the TRB Standing Committee on Education and Training and the National Network for the Transportation Workforce, as well as APTA members and guests from over 90 sites across North America to today's session. We are excited to bring together today's panel members and offer this webinar. Today's topic is one that has been part of our subcommittee's agenda over the past few years, as well as a driver for our 2017 and 2018 labor relations think tank sessions at many of APTA's major meetings. At the end of the day, it's about the relationships, external and internal, that we have with our many partners. How do we initiate and sustain these relationships? How do we ensure that we listen and respect differences in opinions, challenges, wants, and outcomes? How do we find common ground issues that can become the bridges to sustain and strengthen these relationships? Today, we look at models for how both labor and management leaders build and sustain these partnerships and common benefits resulting from these relationships. Today, we are fortunate to have speakers who are recognized experts from the public sector and organized labor. Our panel members plan to discuss areas such as employee safety and security, training and development, maintaining open lines of communication, and more. We believe you are in store for some engaging conversations. As we prepared for today's webinar, our speakers gave us a glimpse into their own stories, perspectives, and experiences, and shared some labor management programs and initiatives already in place. Listen to the lessons learned and the programs and successes shared by these national and local labor and transit leaders. There is a lot to learn from today's speakers. Get ready to take good notes and post your questions to the question box found on the screen. Your questions will be addressed in the second half of the program. As part of today's program, we welcome the following panel of industry leaders. Mr. Corey Bixby, Immediate Past President, Business Agent, ATU Local 1321, Labor Representative CDTA Board, Capital District Transportation Authority, Albany, New York. Mr. Martin Gran, Chief Labor Officer, San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit in Oakland, California. Catherine Lundy, Director, Labor Relations, Chicago Transit Authority, Chicago, Illinois. And finally, Mr. Ed Watt, Director of Special Projects, Amalgamated Transit Union, Washington, D.C. Each of our speakers will offer about 5 to 7 minutes for remarks. After each speaker, we will ask a question. After our last speaker, we will open the floor for your questions submitted to the question box. Use the question box found on your screen to submit your questions. We will read and address your questions aloud during the Q&A segment of the session. And now, let's welcome our first panel member, Corey Bixby, Immediate Past President, Business Agent, ATU Local 1321, Labor Representative, CDTA Board. Corey.
Good afternoon. Thank you, LaShonda. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this webinar, the leadership of our moderators, the experience of our panelists, and all of the various folks from around the country who are logged in today. It has been quite challenging, to say the least, to manage the different hats of being the non-voting labor representative on the CDTA board, an ATU representative, pension trustee, and bus operator that is out on the road serving the public. But I believe that the board members that I serve with usually understand the positions that I take concerning, for example, working conditions, including bus operator access to clean bathroom facilities and the time to use them, bus operator workstation improvements, including seats and mirrors, how this could lead to reduced injuries and workers' comp claims, ventilation in mechanic garages, training for employees, supervisor workload, and representing the needs of office staff. This also includes my view as an employee and the learning curve that I've had of how the transit business actually operates, from various things, including procurement to annual budgeting. In 2015, as union president, I made sure to return to having regular quarterly labor management meetings and also monthly meetings with the CEO. Now, this didn't quite work out as I had planned at the start, but over the last 3 years, I think we had moved to a place of understanding and open dialogue in our relationship. Not that every issue is considered a subject of bargaining, but once a manager is publicly invested in a subject or disciplinary procedure, they usually get stuck defending those actions until the end, because it's considered taboo to make a decision and then admit to not being, how should I say, 100% correct. That is where we have to ensure that we listen to differences of opinions and outcomes. No one party knows everything about every subject, so mistakes happen along the way, but we can correct those mistakes without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to say. We need to get away from having a military-style leadership and have a collaborative relationship. We have had in the past managers that produce low morale like a factory makes widgets. A manager that's terminated and had to re-employ employees, costing the company money. The manager was determined by the State Employees Relations Board to actually interfered with union business. So these are the types of things in our transit system we are improving on, and I think in various transit agencies we need to make these changes to make our agencies better. One thing I wanted to point out is to remember that most employees just want to be heard and then either see those ideas implemented, or even just the fact that they were discussed or tried before and may not have worked. Just because an employee or the union questions how things are done or makes suggestions does not necessarily make them looking to cause trouble. Most of us just want to have input and be listened to and try to make things better. This is why our relationships and open dialogue are so very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. I'd like to ask you a question. In your opinion, why are labor management relations so important?
Well, I think it's important because even though we don't always agree with each other, we still need to work together for the sake of employees and their families. so that we can improve public transportation and the good paying jobs and benefits that come with that. I think an important part of that is discussion before implementation. Again, I think, we might be surprised how many people within our organizations have good ideas or educational or work backgrounds that prove useful in these open discussions. And that's what really, I think, will move our agencies forward.
Well, thank you so much, Corey, and we definitely appreciate your perspective. You've shared some great stories and related lessons, and kudos on your many contributions in the Albany area. We will now welcome our next speaker, Mr. Martin Gran, Chief Labor Officer, San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit, Oakland, California. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much, LaShonda. Well, good day, everyone. I'm Martin Gran. I'm currently the Chief Labor Relations Officer here at BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, and I've been here a little over a year and a half. Prior to that, I was the Employee Relations Director for the City and County of San Francisco, and I had that position for 8 years. And before that, I was with the San Francisco City Attorney's Office, where I was conducting labor arbitrations and both leading and staffing labor negotiation tables. So next slide, please. So negotiator as diplomat. Okay, this might be a little bit corny, but I see myself as a diplomat of sorts. Obviously, I'm part of my agency's management team. And I understand we have both union and management participants in today's presentation. So I'll try to say one side and the other side so I don't mean that this is only applicable to the management side. These are all principles which are applicable to both sides. But as part of my team, I get to help sculpt my team's strategy. What are the goals? What can we expect to get out of negotiations? In other words, what do we want and how do we get there? But of course, I'm also the chief negotiator, which means I've got to roll out the proposals to the union, argue persuasively, I hope, in support of the proposals and navigate the union's responses. And those responses may not always be pleasant, and vice versa when you're on the union side, and I'm sure we've all been in that situation. Why do I think of myself as a diplomat? Well, to be a good diplomat, you have to understand, for lack of a better word, the folks you're dealing with. You need to speak their language. You need to have an idea about what makes them tick, what animates them, what are the hot button issues on the table. I found that different professions just have, can have different mindsets. Police officers may have different mindset than social workers, say, for an example. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. But now let me just give you some thoughts about how you get to be in the position within your agency or organization to become their diplomat. It takes time to gain the information and the understanding you'll need to be trusted enough by your team to help sculpt the policy. Over time, they will see you in action, and they'll verify that you seem to understand your side's core interests, that you can argue well for your side's proposals and also handle the other side's reactions. But let's say you don't have the luxury of time. Obviously, if you're new to your job and your job title is Labor Relations Director or Union President, coming up with these proposals and sculpting these negotiations is your job, and you've got to figure it out pretty quickly. I'd suggest you find, there are a lot of resources, and we'll talk about that, but at the very least, you're going to have to find a colleague or two that you can really trust to give you the background and guidance about how the whole process works in this new jurisdiction you're in. But this is just one of the many areas in labor relations where trust plays a huge role. Next slide, please. There we go. So the importance of trust. One of my coworkers here at BART has an email tagline under the signature that says, progress moves at the speed of trust. I thought that was a pretty interesting concept, and so I based a lot of these thoughts on that idea. So we discussed a minute ago about how you earn the trust of your team, but how do you earn the trust of your counterpart? Excuse me. It obviously helps to have gone through at least one round of prior negotiations, or at least one prior bargaining cycle with the other side. You get to see how the bargaining team works. Who's in charge? Who's persuasive? Are there influential bargaining team members? Are there factions within the team? Does the union's international union or the regional council help or hurt negotiations? Does one side or the other wield political power that will impact the outcome? But even if you haven't participated in a previous round of negotiations, there are still ways to suss out the information you need. You can review bargaining notes and proposals from the last round of bargaining. Frankly, it's more than that you have the ability. You should be reviewing the bargaining notes and the proposals from the last round. Talk to your colleagues who were on the bargaining team and learn as much as you can. Opponent, your other side, I shouldn't say opponent, your labor partner, they'll no doubt be studying up on you. If you're going to build a relationship that will help facilitate a deal, here's what I think they'll be looking for. Will you help or hurt the dynamics at the table? Are you respectful of the process and of the participants? Do you foster thoughtful discussions, or do you fly off the handle? Do you seek to understand the reasons behind the proposal? When you say no to a proposal, do you explain your reasons? And that ever important question, can I have an off-the-record conversation with this person? On that last point, I've negotiated scores of labor contracts, and I can think of only one time where I couldn't have off-the-record conversations. These are very important to be able to have to close a deal. And so we very much hope to build the level of trust with each other that we can have those. Next slide, please. Okay, so quickly, here are some issues or ways to build trust. There's many books written about this. These are just the ones that I found useful but for me as I've gone through this business. Do what you say you're going to do in both large tasks and small. Obviously, when you have predictability, people feel that they can count on you. It's not always possible to meet promised deadlines, but do your best to let the other side know if the deadlines have to slip. Number two, probably most important on this set, don't overpromise. It's really, and I find the hardest thing to accomplish in our business. Here's a common situation. You and your counterpart have been bargaining over an item for weeks. You've been exchanging proposals and counter proposals. And finally, the manager who's on your team, who seems most concerned about this issue, says, fine, I could live with that. Yay, you're done. You're relieved. You tell the other side you're ready to TA, and they whip out a TA, and you sign it. Now off to the next problem. What did you just forget? That's right, your principles. If you haven't kept them up to speed and they don't know what's happening at the table, they could be surprised. And then you've got that horrible situation where you have to, and you hate to do this, but it happened once in a while, happens once in a while. You may have to go back and say that you can't hold up your TA. And of course, that's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a bargaining. You lose all your credibility. Okay, so best procedure in that case is to say you appreciate the movement. It represents an important change in the position, but you do need to take it under advisement and get back to them. Obviously, if you're bargaining on a deadline, you don't have the luxury of time, and that's what cell phones are for. So you may have to get your authority, but always remember to check in with your principals so that they're happy with you, and you don't have to go back to your colleagues on the other side of the table and apologize for not being able to make good on that tentative agreement. Two quick ones here. No surprises. Obviously, if you're trying to build trust, you want to not surprise people especially with bad news. I found it's much better to if you make a mistake, to admit it to the people you need to admit it, own up to it, deal with it. because if it festers, it just gets worse and worse. You all know that. And lastly, don't take the bait. You're at the bargaining table, and there's just so many people that are trying to get a rise out of you. Obviously, if you can do your breathing exercises and get through these with a little bit of humor, with little ways to defuse the situation, I think that goes a long way. Lastly, be yourself, because that also builds trust. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin, for those insightful points on the labor negotiator. So the question I'd like to ask you is, what do you do to keep discussions at the table on track?
Well, let's see. I guess the times when things have been most contentious was back in the 2009-10 era, where we were unfortunately in a position as management to have to come and ask for concessions. And we had been working with all of our unions in San Francisco on this. There's frankly 30 unions to be negotiating with. But at one table in particular, it got very sticky. The union did not want to give up a penny and concessions, and their response was lay us off. And these were service departments where that's very, very difficult. So to make a long story short, I tried my best to get beyond the positions and get to find some commonality. And I frankly said, look, we're people left and right of us are not working. If we don't get the concessions we need, we're going to have layoffs. And so we're not trying to build an empire for management. We're trying to save jobs. And looking around, wouldn't it be better if we all took a small hit, and so that everybody could in this room and the people you represent could keep their jobs? And we finally did come to an agreement. So I think it's important to find the commonalities and the shared interests below what might appear to be very polarized positions.
Thank you, Martin. Again, some excellent examples and insights of programs and partnerships at work with collaboration and some big benefits paying off in the end. So at this time, let me welcome my colleague, Patrice McElroy, co-moderator for today's program.
Thank you, LaShonda. And thank you so much, Martin and Corey, for the insightful information. It has been a good learning experience so far. I have definitely gained some information. Our next speaker, Catherine Lundy, Director, Labor Relations, Chicago Transit Authority, Chicago, Illinois. Catherine comes to us with many years of labor relations experience in the industry.
If you could go to the next. My name is Catherine Lundy. Like they just said, I'm from the Chicago Transit Authority. I've been doing this labor relations thing here for about 5.5 years. We'll be 6 pretty soon. CTA has 17 unions, and some of those unions have multiple collective bargaining agreements. CTA as an entity goes back about 70 years, but many of our unions are actually older than the agency itself, going back to over 100 years when Chicago first started getting public transit. What I'll be talking about today is listening as the key to finding out what the other side really wants. And of course, this is something that works for both unions and management. A lot of times if somebody says, you know, I'm really looking to get this person put back to work, you listen to that and you're like, okay, well, that sounds pretty straightforward. What's that person? What happened with that person? You let them go into their details and tell you what happened, right? Where you're going, what the next steps they're looking for are. Now, of course, the next steps that one side is looking for are not always the next steps that the other side is looking for. So the real key is figuring out where they're going with something. If somebody's asking to be put back to work, well, is it because they were out of service for something they did? Did they have to leave due to a personal emergency, a family emergency? Where are they looking to go from there? My example here is about pay progression. This was an issue that I was dealing with one of our largest unions. They brought up an issue where supervisory employees who then went into instruction, which is seen as a promotion, but both jobs are at the same pay scale, found themselves taking a longer time to reach the top pay once they became an instructor than they would have if they had just remained a supervisor. So the initial question from the union was, hey, this person feels like he got a demotion when he should have gotten a promotion. All right, that sounds really bad. So let's open up that nut, right? Like, let's start peeling off the layers of the onion and see where this is going. In this case, the initial statement of the person feels like they got a demotion when they should have gotten a promotion, despite the fact that they did indeed go from supervisor to instructor. The person was at the cusp of getting up to a new pay rate when they got the promotion. So instead of going to that next pay rate, they were stuck at the pay rate that they had been at for 3 whole years. Now, the union's initial statement was, this person got a pay cut. Well, that's terrible. But then you start looking in, you start asking the questions, and it turns out they didn't get a pay cut. They got held at the same rate for 3 years when they should have been seeing small incremental step increases over that time. The question then, as labor relations, was to go to the user department, in this case, training and instruction, and say, hey, what happened here? Is this the progression that you guys are looking for? Or do we want to see the person continue to get those pay grade step improvements over time? The user department in this case said, well, the person has to be an instructor 1 for 3 years, which is at the grade 8 pay level, before they can go to instructor 2, which is the grade 9 pay level. Of course, grade 8 being less pay than grade 9. But the question was, well, if they'd remained a supervisor, they would have gone to grade 9 earlier. So is there anything that we can do for them? Working back and forth between the using department and the union, we were able to come to a compromise where we determined that, yes, the person would have to be an instructor 1 for 3 years, but they could continue to see that pay progression as if they had remained a supervisor over time. That all came from asking questions, digging deep into the facts, and finding out what people really wanted. When you go from this person feels like they got a demotion to, well, maybe they just didn't get the pay rises that they thought they were going to get, was several steps, and it all came from asking questions and listening to what those answers were. Next slide, please. Asking questions is the number one, I've found, the number one way to build trust, to build the respect that you need on both your side of the table and on the other side of the table. One of the other ways that you can do that, of course, is, as Martin mentioned, the sidebar conversation, or as we call it here, the caucus. Sometimes having a caucus, meaning asking the other side to step out of the room and talking only with your side, can be an extremely powerful tool. And that's pretty basic concept. But another time, or another way that a caucus can be powerful, is by you talking directly to 1 or 2 people from the other side to try and find out where they're really going with their facts. And now sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you're going to get a situation where the union, in my case, the union, and sometimes if you're on the union side, management isn't going to tell you where they're going with something. And that's fine, but you can usually piece it out if you ask the active questions and you listen to what their answers are. That's all for me.
Thank you, Catherine. This is great. I think you gave us some really, really important information on listening, and not only listening, but communication. So far, we've heard trust. We've heard about listening and building relationships. I do have a question for you, Catherine. What is your recommendation when you have a manager and a union rep that have differences of opinion that they cannot overcome. How would you handle that?
So that is a situation that I have dealt with in the past. We had our second biggest union is our rail union, and their president a few years ago and CTA's president were both big personalities, and they clashed to the point where the only person who could answer phone calls from the union president at the authority was me. So I got phone calls from him, of course, frequently, because issues come up frequently, and that's the point of labor relations, right, is to work with the union. But at that point, you have to become almost like a translator. You have to listen to what they say, hear what the union's real issue is, and if it's, the union president is hurt that nobody else is picking up his phone calls, that is something that you have to sort of hold his hand and say, well, I'm not so bad to talk to after all, am I? And to make sure that you're following through with the questions that he has and with the issues that he's bringing to your attention. On the other side, though, you also need to make sure that you are taking those issues to where they need to go in management, and sometimes softening the blow, like, yes, this guy's a big personality. Yes, he's going to come in, he's going to go on TV, he's going to do all these things. But we need to respond to this because this is a real issue. And getting management to sort of open up and help you, help them, and help the union in the long run. So again, it all comes down to listening.
Thank you, Catherine. Those are very, very excellent points. I think you have provided us with great insights, and there's always a lot to learn in terms of building relationships and listening. Now we turn our attention to hear from our final speaker, Mr. Ed Watt, Director, Special Projects, Amalgamated Transit Union. He comes to us with a distinguished career. Mr. Watt.
Well, hello, good day. I would like to thank LaShonda and Patrice and Joe and all the folks at APTA that made this happen, and of course all the folks that are listening in here. You can read my bio, but I've been involved in labor relations as a chief steward, 800 folks in a bus depot in Brooklyn since 1986. And at one point had 20 bargaining units in the local in New York that we dealt with, and I was in that position for 9 years. So first slide, the intro slide. Thanks. And then let's just there is one benefit that I've finally received for being at the end of the alphabet, and that's as you can see that I get to go last and can actually make a couple of comments, which I'm going to take the liberty to do for a second. Corey touched on many of the key issues involved, and it just struck a chord when he said that most employees want to be heard. But more so, I think they just want to make a living and they just want to raise their families, like I would bet everybody on the line wants to do. And they also don't come to work to get into accidents or to mess up. They're real people with real lives. And so why should we be in conversations with frontline workers? I think the biggest reason is that the people who are actually doing the job every day know the most about it. I'm absolutely disqualified as being an expert because, at least in the job titles, not in labor relations, because I haven't driven a bus in 17 years. But so I think that in order to have, in a more like overview type, you need to engage the frontline workers through the union, which is the legal way to do it, on any project that you want. We'll talk about a few in a minute. And it includes getting them right in on the inception of whatever project you want to run or mutual endeavor, in the development and in the delivery. This goes from all sorts of items, safety, training, even transit funding and advocacy. The folks on the union side can be helpful. Next slide. Thank you. So I think this is the reality, not all. There's some shining examples out there. We'll talk about one or two of them perhaps, but many labor relations are broken. And I think the important breakthroughs are possible in safety, as I mentioned, and that's what I'm going to cover first. The SMS implementation is coming up, as everyone knows, being mandated by the Public Transportation Safety Public Agency Plan, perhaps. I should know that because I've been on the TRACS committee for, well, as a charter member from 2010. And since they haven't met in the last 2 years, I'll say to 2016. So we laid out some things in there that I think can be helpful to this conversation from the, and you can find them on the website. I'm going to go through a few of them, but you can find them on the TRACS website under reports to the letter reports to the administrator. And basically the communication standards which they endorsed states that employees shall be involved in the development and review of policies and procedures to manage risk, consulted where there are any changes that affect workplace health and safety, represented on all health and safety matters, and that they should have the time and the resources to actively participate. Also in the appendix of that document, under indicators of effective safety management, you can look at some other of the steps. So I'd like to talk for 1 minute on a bus operator assault committee from my days in New York. We had a horrible assault on a female operator, and it drew quite an amount of press attention and obviously attention from our members. And at that time, it was 2002, we started an assault committee that worked with all departments of management, so operations safety, safety and security, and the executive office to, and they met about once a month, about 40 people in a committee. They came up with a report that unfortunately, between changes in administration on management side, had gotten put on a shelf, and there wasn't a lot being done with it. But in late 2008, one of the operators was killed, was murdered on a bus, and we didn't have to appoint a committee, right? When something horrific happens, and people step up, and they're going to have the answers, and they're going to appoint a committee. And I think somebody once said, if you want something done, you appoint one person, and if you want nothing done, you appoint a committee. Well, we had the equivalent of one person, and that was in the report that the committee had done, that this union management committee had done. And so we were able to implement many of the recommendations almost on the spot. The other, excuse me, the other place where people can work together, I believe, is in retention, which I know is a big issue in all properties, at least many properties. I can't speak for all, I guess. And so the Transportation Learning Center has put together a lot of management and labor committees. I think anywhere between a half dozen to a dozen. There's probably a couple of people from the Transportation Learning Center on the phone, and they might be able to present some resources, but you can check the website. It basically started in a program that I think was started in San Jose, and working with the union, they helped increase the retention by actually mentoring some of the operators as they went along. Instead of having some probation mallet being held over your head, you had somebody to turn to and say, hey, you know, this just happened, what do you think? Or, you know, yesterday this happened, how should I handle that in the future? And it wasn't somebody who would be looking necessarily to discipline you. So I think that at the end of the day, that people are just looking for dignity and respect. If you follow any of the labor relations struggles around the country, teachers are kind of like their time in the box, in the barrel, so to speak. They're crying out for dignity and respect, and I think that's just the essence of some of the words that we've heard today. We've heard respect, we've heard trust, and so the question I would like to ask is, like, are these good relations just wishful thinking, or is this actually possible? Can we have the next slide? So on the next slide, and you can read it yourself, if employees come first, then everybody prospers. And this was Herb Keller, who from Southwest Airlines, who recently passed away. I did have some experience with Southwest Airlines, and although I'm not in the business of endorsing any employer, I absolutely can say that on safety, these folks were at least one of the best, if not the best, that I've ever dealt with. So next slide. I just like to close with make employee involvement your highest priority, and that's my message. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really good perspective, Ed, on relationships. I have a question. How would you approach developing a commonality? So if you're going into an agency and you're not really seeing that, how would you suggest getting together the labor and the management and making a commonality or addressing the commonality?
So I would say that at all levels, depending on the size of your agency, at all levels where people have counterparts, that you require that those counterparts meet on a regular basis, and you don't have to divulge everything, but that some minutes of that should be forwarded up the chain of command on both sides. So your depot chair and your whoever the barn chief is should meet on a regular basis and talk about the issues that aren't necessarily mandated through either employee requests, demands, grievances, or discipline. And then you should just mandate that to happen all the way up the line.
Thank you, Ed. You provided some great vision and examples that many of us could use at our organization. That was really insightful. Thank you.
Well, it's now that point in our program when I would like to invite all members of our panel for continued conversation and dialogue with our audience. If anyone in today's audience has a question for our panel members, you can submit your questions via the question box found on your screen. We will read your questions aloud and direct them to our panel members. We will do our best to answer all your questions.
LaShonda, this is APTA staff here. In terms of some initial questions, they may go back, I think, to some of the earlier conversations. And one question sort of addresses, it's in the spirit of trust, in terms of how do you ensure that off-the-record conversations are in fact kept off the record and confidential?
That would be a great question. I think Martin Graham and Catherine Lundy talked about that. Martin, do you want to address that?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, and you really have to think long and hard about the person you're dealing with to decide whether they're going to protect that conversation the way you would expect them to. I've only been here at BART for a year and a half, and I just wrapped up what took 7 months to do a police contract, and I didn't know the chief negotiator for the police union, and I had to think long and hard about whether I wanted to invest that trust in him, and so I think I started small. Asking, well, what if off the record, what if we did this in exchange for that? And he'd say, well, maybe I can do that, and we pulled that off. And so we moved down the road. I guess that we built on a tiny little kernel of seedling of trust, and I think we grew it. And by the end, I think we forged a very good relationship, which helped us get a contract together that both sides see a lot of value in, and they passed by very high margins by both parties.
Thank you. Catherine, do you have anything to add to that?
So to answer the question of how do you make sure that things stay off the record, my answer would be you don't, right? Other than you have to have that trust in the other person. Because of course you can't follow them around and go every time they start talking about it to somebody else, even if they do at all. So my perspective would be, if you're going to go off the record with someone, you're going to have that caucus, you're going to have that sidebar. You just got to say things that they might get out there, right? That person might say, yeah, this is off the record, and then decide to share it with their buddy on their side of the table anyway. So just be careful in what you say, be measured, think twice, speak once, would be my advice in that situation.
Teresa, I would just add that recently I had an off the record case with a different union here, and they came guns a-blazing. You said this and you said that at a larger meeting, and I took them aside immediately and said, folks, I know you're to keep have that kind of relationship. That's going to really make it hard for us to move forward. And they immediately apologized, and so hopefully we're back on track. So sometimes you have to call them out.
Thank you. I do have another question for the panel. Why is it so important to keep the lines of communication open? So give us some insight on the thoughts of keeping that communication open on both sides. Maybe Corey, you'd like to chime in on this?
Sorry, I had you on mute there. Well, communication is just so important, because if we don't have it, then we're not getting things done. So we all see that. Sometimes we get into the thought process of looking at each other, like we discussed, as enemies. And I like the comment that was made about partners, because that's really what we're in, is a partnership, and we have to have an open door policy to exchange ideas and resolve issues. Because again, if at some point we're sitting in our office and the company's in their office, we're not getting things accomplished that have to be done for the sake of all of our the employees.
Thank you.
Patrice, sorry, Patrice. Question also, Ed, I think this goes back to your citing the experience at VTA. And one of our audience members recognized there's a good practice at VTA for a Vegas rule on and off the record discussions between mentors and new operators. And the comment was that this practice in fact works. Could you perhaps give some additional insights on the message from our audience member?
For VTA, sure. Oh, is that Ms. Ed?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm the director of special projects, but not of every project. So I really would be doing a disservice if I spoke to that. I'd just like to refer you to the Transportation Learning Center. I'm sorry, but it makes sense. It's a great saying. But I've been, I was in a meeting or two in the beginning of that, but I haven't been following up. So I would like to answer you, but get me another one.
I have something that I could add to you, Ed. Having familiarity with the Bay Area and talking with the actual both sides of the VTA mentorship. One example of something that mentorship program does, when a new operator gets on, they are, eager, ready to move forward, ready to hit all of their marks in terms of all of their stops. And what a mentor can say to them and has said to them is, hey, wait a minute, you get paid for 8 hours. You don't have to go so fast, because if you go fast, you're going to make a mistake. Sit back, drive, or be aggressive, not, they can talk to you about how to drive, how to handle an employee, or not an employee, I'm sorry, but a passenger. It's the relationship that someone is open enough to go to someone else and say, how do you handle this situation? And a mentor can give them that guidance. And that has been helpful for that program. That's just some of the things that I learned being in the Bay Area. So I just add to that.
Patrice, this is APTA staff. I think your comment also addresses another question from our audience, which is, what advice would you give to an individual who's not been involved in the negotiation process? So I think you kind of hit a well on that point.
Yes. Does anyone else have any other insights on kind of building that mentorship relationships, or as Joe has said, others that how do you get into just any feedback from our panel members? Okay.
Well, this is Martin Grant. It's a tough question. It's a tough area of, at least on the management side. You have your people that are on your team, and and it's great if you can start having a great working relationship with people who get it, have an aptitude for the work, or sort of have the attributes that you think are the raw material, for becoming a very competent negotiator. And they're, in my opinion, a lot of attention to detail, especially if you're supporting a table, sort of people who are forward-leaning and are interested and come up with ideas that may be a little bit above their pay grade. But that's just a wonderful thing to happen when someone says, well, what if we pair up these two things and see if we can get them to drop this if they take this? So when that happens to me, of course, it may not even be altruistic. It's self-interested to give them more responsibility as we go, and then to give them tables that are where I think they can succeed, maybe some meet and confers, and kind of grow them. But it's I think a different kind of situation than what Ed would be referring to, and it's sort of more of an institutional situation from the union side, where you just have between labor and management, where you have hundreds of workers that you want to make sure they have an avenue for learning. And I don't know how they do it on the union teams as they go up through the job steward, up through the officers. Maybe it's very similar.
Well, this is Ed Watt. If I could point out, I understand that there's that Martin and Catherine are negotiators, but in terms of day-to-day labor relations, it's really a small part, and it's relatively scripted to a certain extent, and necessary, but sometimes not sufficient for good relationships. So part of my presentation that I hope to get across is that there's so many other facets where labor management relationships, if partnerships are fruitful, can be extended. And then when you get to the table every so years, what you've done for the last 2 or 3 years actually literally sets the table. And so I think that's why I know, at least that's why I wanted to talk about those safety items and places where we could work together.
Thank you, Ed. I think you were what you provided in terms of commonalities, and I think that was why I asked those questions of how do you get at other commonalities. But you talked about safety is huge. You talked about retention, which is our huge pieces. Is there any other, if you're looking at just trying to find a commonality, is there any other big ticket item, as I would say, that you would provide us that an agency can look at to just get the conversation going?
Well, how about transit advocacy or funding advocacy, right? Or getting people to, we just were part of a broad coalition that celebrated Transit Equity Day on Rosa Parks' birthday. Many of you may have had demonstrations, proclamations, press conferences, or whatever done in your towns. I know we did a lot of work on the West Coast on it. Everybody in transit should want more people on the bus and subway. So I think that's a no-brainer, right? More jobs for us, more jobs for the union, more job security for management. I think that's a place where you can really make a difference. Thanks.
LaShonda and Patrice, we've got, I think, probably our final question and comment from the audience. And the comment is around organizations' mission statements that speak to them and the values and worth by their employees. So if maybe folks may want to comment on sort of an organization's mission statement as a way to help wrap up this afternoon.
Sounds good. Corey, do you have any thoughts about how your organization's mission statement and the visions and the things they espouse, how that may help build on the relationships between employee-employer?
Well, probably nothing too exciting. I mean, I'm sure we all realize how difficult that is. I mean, in a management position, you have, the board that is you report to, and you're trying to get, everything done that runs the company. And then from an employee standpoint, which I found myself, getting wrapped up in, you're looking at driving a bus or fixing a bus, and this is what I deal with on a everyday. Very common, I think, in many I work on a bus all day, or I drive a bus all day. It's hard for me. I've tried to, in my different positions, share with why we count customers, because it provides funding for the entire organization, or this is how we do something this way. And I don't know, but I'm sure we all struggle with that. So the work to get everybody on board and pulling in the same direction.
Yes, I do understand what you mean. Martin or Catherine, do either of you have any thoughts on the question?
So CTA's mission statement is that we deliver quality, affordable transit services that link people, jobs, and communities. And I think that board that, delivering quality, affordable transit services to link people, jobs, and communities is something everybody supports, right? If you polled a room of people to say, one or two curmudgeons in there, but generally speaking, people are going to be on board with that. So transit advocacy as a way to supporting and underlining the mission statement, I think is something that we could really, I think we could make a lot of motion on between both CTA and the unions. So I know I've got a good takeaway from today. Thanks, Ed.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your engaging participation. Please join Bree, Martin, Catherine, and Ed. To our partners and audience members, thank you everyone for being a part of an excellent session. Clearly, this topic was a big hit, lots of lessons learned and shared, and I think we can all build on the takeaway that we want to link people, jobs, and communities, and that's what's going to make each of the organizations we represent great. So today's slides, the audio recording, and additional resources will be posted to the APTA website, webinar series page within the next few weeks. Thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you at future sessions.